Hi everyone, I hope this finds you doing well. A couple of weeks ago, I released an update to Illuminated Cloud with a very tight integration with October Swimmer's AER, or Apex Execution Runtime, that allows local Apex unit test execution, debugging, coverage analysis, things like that. It's a pretty remarkable tool from October Swimmer, and I've gotten a lot of good feedback on the integration. And as always, I've continued to kind of iterate, refine, enhance that integration. I want to show one of the new features here. Now, this is going to be a relatively short demo, but if you haven't seen the previous demo, I'd recommend going and looking at it, the more extensive demo of the integration with AER, and then coming back here because it'll set the context. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and talk about what this integration is? Well, AER has a feature that allows you to create a continuous feedback loop for your unit test execution. It is established using the -- watch flag whenever you run AER for test execution. So if we go into the application level Apex settings for Illuminated Cloud, in addition to run with AER, debug with AER, run with coverage with AER, there's now an enable watch with AER option. Of course, you could disable this if you want. If you're using AER, you probably want it on. And then there's an associated option that says when we're doing this continuous feedback loop, let's disable deploy on save. And so that means that you're very focused on your local continuous feedback loop that is facilitated by AER in its local execution runtime, and you don't have to wait on deployments to the organization and such for the most part. Now, obviously, if you prefer that everything gets deployed to the organization every time you press Control S or Command S, you can just disable this option. And even if you have it enabled, the other deployment actions like force save and deploy all metadata and deploy modified metadata, they still work. It's just a matter of what happens when you press Control S or Command S. So we're going to leave that on for this demo. Excuse me. And hopefully the reason for it being disabled will make sense. Now I am going to show very quickly that if I just press Control S here real quick, that deploy on save is enabled. It's deploying this to the organization. And by the way, this project is the Apex open source library, really nice library of just a lot of different things. And I'm using that for this demo because it's fairly broad. It has a moderate amount of Apex source as well as auxiliary like some custom objects, some custom metadata types, things like that AER also has to compile to have the whole project worldview as it executes, because it has to know how to resolve those references to objects, to custom labels, to flows, things like that. And so we're going to use this to represent a moderate sized project. Now, how do we get started here? Well, just as with all these other executors, I've got my all tests run config here. I'm going to go up here, but I'm going to use watch all tests with AER as my executor. And when I start it, it's going to look like any other executor. It's going to go out because it's all tests. It's going to execute all the tests. You can see in the title bar here it says watch with AER instead of run or cover with AER, things like that. And it took several seconds in order to get to the point where it's finished. And the reason is the very first iteration. Again, AER has to compile. It has to take a look at and compile all the information about all the metadata in your project, or at least that you've pointed it at. You see that it says that the unit tests themselves executed in about 2.5 seconds, but in reality, that was once it finished that compilation phase. Now, why do I bring that up? I bring it up because AER has an incremental compiler, and we're going to see the benefits of that as we make changes in this continuous feedback loop. Now, you can see that this test run, unlike if I'd used the run executor or the run with coverage executor, it hasn't terminated. It's now moved into a watching for changes mode. And so let's go make some changes. So let's say that this or condition here, that the default fallback value, I'm thinking maybe it should be true instead of false. And I'm going to hit Control S. There's no deployment, but you can see that AER immediately goes into a test execution mode and is showing me that I've just introduced 3 test regressions. And by the way, you may have seen earlier that this tree was empty. You can see the past tests, but I think having them filtered out makes for a nice kind of continuous feedback experience, because you only see the issues as they're introduced and as they're resolved. So again, in about 2.5 seconds, it was able to show me that I'd introduced 3 regressions. Oops, I made a mistake. I'm going to back that out, and we'll see that AER immediately begins re-executing tests. And again, within about 2.5 seconds, I can see that I now have no failures. I've actually backed out the change that introduced those regressions. And we can even create more catastrophic failures here. Like I can take this entire inner class and I can make it so that it's no longer available, which is going to create not just test failures, it's going to create linkage failures. So I'm going to hit Control S again, or Command S if you're on a Mac, and you can see that 16 tests failed. A little over 2 seconds, 16 tests failed, and we can see those failures. And these aren't unit test failures; these are actual linkage failures, or if you had compilation failures that failed the compiler, if you had semantic failures where it passes the compiler but it doesn't necessarily meet Apex's semantic rules, then you would see those here. And by the way, in order to allow this to continue to run when you've got these types of errors, I've added the AER option. There's a new option that is for skipping errors that effectively tells AER, compile everything that you can, run everything that you can, report the things that you can't because of parse failures or semantic failures or whatever they happen to be, but continue to do everything that you can. I think that's going to be an important option when you're talking about this continuous feedback loop, because you are going to make changes that at least temporarily are going to put things into a bad state, and you want to know where that bad state is, and you also want to know what the net effect is, and you want to be able to recover from it while you're in this continuous feedback loop. So I'll go ahead and bring this back in, and we'll see it re-execute, and within 2.5 seconds roughly, we're back in a good state. So you can see what this is like. And you may be asking, okay, that's great for unit test results. What about coverage? I want to see not just when I've introduced regressions in unit tests or when I've actually fixed unit tests, but I want to see when I've degraded my coverage or I've enhanced my coverage. And I've actually got that going here locally, but I'm not including that in this build because there's a major UX issue. And that is that when it first runs, it's opening the coverage tool window. And then each time that AER goes through one of these watch cycles, it's closing and reopening that tool window. So it's kind of flipping back and forth. And to me, that was just incredibly disruptive to your standard development workflow. So I'm working on trying to make it so that instead it opens the first time and then it refreshes right here, but it's a more static state. I may need to talk to JetBrains about that. We'll see. So it is something I'm working on, because to me, it makes sense that you want to see in this continuous feedback loop, how are things going from just a functional regression standpoint, and how are things going from a coverage standpoint? How well are you actually driving hopefully legitimate coverage of your business logic? So I'm working on that. I don't have that yet. And by the way, once I have that, and even before I have that, obviously these tool windows take up significant valuable editor real estate. You can always move these off. You can change the view mode. You can put them into a float or into a window and move them off to another screen, or if you've got a tiling window manager, into another tile. And therefore you can regain that valuable editor real estate while you're still getting the benefits of basically continuous feedback loop and the ability to support things like test-driven development. And then the last thing I wanted to say here with regard to this is, okay, so this is running in the background and we actually have an AER process behind it that we're monitoring. What happens when you're kind of done? Well, you can just stop this the way that you would stop any other running process. So you can press stop here, you can press stop here, you can close the project, you can exit the application. It is going to wait for AER to complete. In fact, you may have very briefly there seen waiting for AER termination before it went into a stop state. And that's obviously important, because what we don't want to do is leave a lot of orphaned AER processes sitting there watching the exact same file system for the exact same changes, and then potentially having constant recompilation across multiple processes. That's going to obviously not be very resource efficient. So IC should not be leaving orphaned AER processes, and that's how you kind of stop it. When you're ready, you can just restart it here, or you can go back up here and execute it. It does make sense to me that you would execute this against a more broad scope unit test run configuration like all tests, or if you want to create one that's for a specific module or subset of your code base. But for the most part, it makes sense to me that this will not be for just like one class or one method in a class, but for in general your entire project you would be watching. Although it does allow execution on pretty much any unit test run configuration. So that's it. That's what I wanted to show. Now, needless to say, if there are issues, let me know about them. While I was developing this integration, I did see some situations where I would, purposefully introduce a regression. I would see the regression here. I would revert that to where everything should be passing, and I would still see some failures. And it was because of some issues in the incremental compiler used by AER. I sent those over to October Swimmer. I think most of those have been resolved. I may have seen one other earlier today. If you see something like that, feel free to use me as a front line for anything that you see with this integration. I may immediately redirect you to AER's public issue tracker if I feel like, if I'm confident that it's something that needs to be reported there. But always feel free to use me as a front line on this integration. If you see other issues with the way the IC is behaving or something like that, certainly let me know and I'll take care of it. Otherwise, have at it. Let me know what you think. I think this is huge, right? Oh, and by the way, now that I've stopped this watch with AER and I press Control S, you can see that deploy on save is of course working again. You may have seen me pointing at the status bar there, but that option only disables it while there's an actively executing AER watch process. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much for your time and take care. Bye.